Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Spencer Pelton. Spencer is the Wyoming state archaeologist and an adjunct professor of anthropology at the University of Wyoming. He's interested in the prehistoric archaeology of Wyoming and the Rocky Mountain West, with an emphasis on the archaeology of the Paleolithic. We talk about subjects ranging from the modern human expansion out of Africa to ethnographic research in Mongolia and paleoindian red ochre mines, to name a few. My name is Sebastian Weatherby, and this is The Tell. Hey, Spencer.
Hey, how's it going?
How's it going? So, I've known about your work for a while, your work as the Wyoming state archaeologist, and generally I know you're interested in paleoindian archaeology, so Ice Age North America, ancient hunter-gatherers in Wyoming. But reading your dissertation, it betrayed that you actually have a very global set of interests in terms of the Paleolithic, and a lot of interest in the expansion of anatomically modern humans around the world. So I was wondering, what is to you, what is the unifying thread between those two interests that connects them for you?
I think the unifying thread between them is I'm interested in finding universal human process. How do humans behave? What's human nature?
Mm-hmm.
How do humans respond predictably to a number of environmental stimuli? So I take that same approach into both of those kind of research realms. I do find it hard to balance, I guess. I find it hard primarily because I love doing archaeological field work, and so I spend all my time dealing with that, doing field work, curating artifacts, reporting what we found. That's kind of like an imperative for that. And so getting into these kind of higher level theoretical concepts and trying to publish on that stuff while at the same time maintaining an active fieldwork agenda is probably the most difficult thing to balance.
Right.
I decided to do a topic like that for my dissertation because I kind of thought, this is the time to do it. If you want to tackle a big question, here's 5 years you have to kind of think about things really deeply, develop ideas in a way that you might not necessarily be able to do once you get into a career, even if it's a teaching career, academic career. So I really wanted to develop those research interests during my dissertation, really for the purpose that I didn't think I'd have another chance to do it.
Yeah. If I had to sum it up and tell me if this sounds right, is you were looking at how humans left Africa, migrated across the globe in the Paleolithic, and you were thinking about how they adapted to the harsh, cold weather they faced along the way. And a big part of your work involved using principles from human behavioral ecology, or HBE, which I guess helped you construct a model, right, for predicting how ancient hunter-gatherers ought to react to different temperatures and how they should adapt to those.
Yeah, I'd say so. I'd say just more broadly how people in general respond to temperature. It's like HBE has been pretty concerned primarily with what you eat. The decision variables in HBE models are oftentimes based around what do you forage and when under varying environmental circumstances. I kind of wanted to take that similar idea and apply it to temperature. What decisions do you make at varying temperatures, and how universal is that between human cultures, and how did those decisions shape the trajectory of modern human dispersal?
What to you is what drew you to human behavioral ecology in the first place as a lens for thinking about the past?
It's one of the only approaches that allows you to create defined expectations for the world that have predictive power. And even if those models are dumb, and ultimately all models are wrong, at least you have a defined set of principles against which you can evaluate the material record. And that form a baseline from which you can actually build some semblance of truth from. That's really why I wanted to get into that kind of theoretical realm.
Going off that point, would you mind if I read you a quote? Because this, and sorry, it's a little wordy, it made me think about why archaeology needs objectivity, why it needs an approach that at least moves us in the direction of objectivity. So here it is. It has been the failure of the social sciences to develop a robust body of principles serving the methodological needs of the fields in question. This failure has doomed those alleged sciences to endless paradigmatic debate and endless stylistic replacements of one theory by another, largely in response to sociological characteristics within the discipline and in step with simple rates of generational replacement within the academy. That's Lewis Binford.
Oh, really? Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't think I've read that one, but it's absolutely true. I mean, it's kind of how anthropology kind of got trapped in that cycle. I think probably starting in the 80s or 90s, where I think what's left out of that is it's also really subject to the politics du jour. So you can kind of see these really popular models of how to explain the past emerging in lockstep with major political trends. I would argue right now it's climate change. Honestly, everybody wants to try to frame their interpretations of human behavior or the functioning of ancient societies in terms of climate change, right?
Yeah.
And maybe it's true in some cases, but I think entering into the process of science with these kind of ultimately transient ideas that are inextricably related to the politics of whatever society you're living in, it kind of ends up being dead ends, and you end up starting over. Mm-hmm. Again, you end up like Benford was saying, in these kind of loops, and you never move forward. You just kind of rehash the same debates over and over again.
Yeah.
And absolutely, I think HB is one approach to kind of escaping that.
So in your dissertation, you break up the human migrations out of Africa in the Paleolithic into three big stages, really. Why did you divide them that way? What did you see as being the three big steps?
So the first stage I see as people leaving Africa without having to adopt adaptations to extremely cold temperatures. And I did some pretty basic environmental modeling to show that you could feasibly walk from Africa around the Indian Ocean into Indonesia, Sunda and Sahul, mm-hmm. without ever having to develop complex clothing or houses. Or you could be naked and homeless, is the way I talk about it.
And we're talking about, what, 70,000 years ago?
I think I placed it in my dissertation around 70 to 80,000 years ago, something like that. Because we know people were in Australia at this point, at least 50 to 60,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it would have been this kind of initial wave that rather than kind of forming this front that just kind of expanded continuously across the Eurasian continent, it really conformed to these thermal clines that existed along the coast of the Indian Ocean and drew people into Australia.
So they're really being kept at bay by the more extreme weather conditions,
right? The
northern part of Eurasia.
The decision variable there is pretty simple. Do you keep moving in these places where you can remain naked and homeless, mm-hmm. or do you adopt these really costly technologies to expand into colder places? And in my mind, the decision in that case is really simple. You don't intensify your technology. You keep in places where you can keep foraging without these costs, and you keep moving along those thermal clines. And then, then once you get to Southeast Asia, it just gets warmer from there, right? You can move south into Sunda, Sahul, eventually Australia. And that's what I see as the first wave of global human dispersal.
But so if people are avoiding taking on these costly technologies and behavioral adaptations to being able to live in colder weather, what then would force them to start moving into colder areas and adopting some of these practices if it wasn't very convenient in the first place?
I think population density
would
be my suspicion. Yeah. Once you fill up those spaces that are easiest to inhabit, then there's nowhere else to move, and you got to start moving in other places and take on those technological challenges. Mm-hmm. That'd be my guess. So that would lead into the second phase, which is the way I see it is the movement of modern humans up through Eurasia. So probably first radiating into Eastern Eurasia in the areas like the Lake Baikal region. I think they call it the Trans-Altai region, mm-hmm. and then eventually moving into to Western Eurasia and replacing Neanderthals whenever the date is now, somewhere around 40,000 years ago.
Oh, so people actually get to Central Asia before they get to, say,
The
Europe?
timeline looks like that to me,
Yeah.
is to my recollection. Like some of the earliest what we recognize as upper Paleolithic sites are not in Western Eurasia, not in places like Spain, France, these kind of like famous Germany. These famous upper Paleolithic sites actually emerge seemingly a little earlier in the eastern part of the Eurasian continent. And then, because, really the last Neanderthal skeletons we have come from like Spain, Portugal, the Gibraltar region, right? So it's kind of the last stand of that life way.
What do the people moving into colder climates have at this point that they don't appear to have prior, or that, say, Neanderthals or other hominins who are in those areas don't seem to have? Like, what's setting them apart? What's giving them access to that sudden new space?
I think two primary things that we can see archaeologically. The first is complex garments, complex fitted garments, I should specify. So the most widespread evidence, the thing that's most widely cited for that, is bone needles show up at this time. Also, you see it in, say, carved figurines and things like that. You see hats.
Right, you get to see some direct evidence of what kind of clothing they're wearing.
So the advantage of that, and I think the advantage that modern humans had over Neanderthals in that regard, is when you have complex fitted garments, it's not that you can survive those temperatures, it's that you can thrive in them. So you can remain foraging on the landscape, hunting and gathering for a longer duration of each year. When you have these complex fitted garments, if you did not have those technologies, you would basically have to be holed up in a dwelling or a cave or whatever.
Right, so you might be surviving the weather, but you're not exactly using your time very well at that point.
Exactly. And that's why I think, for instance, Neanderthals, there's all this evidence for seasonal stressors in their skeletal remains, for like things like Harris lines and enamel hypoplasia.
Oh, really?
And my suspicion is that that's these annual times of dietary and physiological stress that occur during the winter, when they're basically kind of having to hole up and subsist off of very sparse resources, have to keep themselves warm against really extremely cold temperatures and that kind of thing. And it's extremely stressful, and you can see that bioarchaeologically. So,
For like the Neanderthals, we're not seeing the same kind of building of like complex freestanding structures and things like that, right?
So that's the second technology, I think. And I think more controversially, I think houses emerge alongside this second wave of modern human dispersal in Eurasia. Yeah. Before the Upper Paleolithic in Eurasia, associated with anatomically modern humans, there really is no evidence at all, either in Africa or Eurasia, for freestanding houses. What freestanding houses did was it enabled anatomically modern humans to expand into environments that were previously uninhabitable by archaic hominins. Because
otherwise you need a cave or a lean-to or something, basically, right? A rock shelter.
You essentially need the geothermal properties of a cave to withstand some of these temperatures, and so therefore you're bound to mountainous regions mainly that have those environments. Whereas when you start developing freestanding structures, you can start expanding out into the plains of Ukraine and Russia, things like that, and expanded the niche considerably, allowed people to hunt a greater diversity of fauna, pursue those fauna for longer durations of each year. And I think the ultimate outcome of that was anatomically modern humans were just able to sustain larger population growth numbers than Neanderthals could. And so eventually that led to them
just swamped eventually,
supplanting those genetics.
Yeah, probably a lot of people don't know this about caves, that they basically hover at the annual mean temperature for wherever they're located. So in the summer, you go inside and they're cool and they're like 50 degrees. And then in the winter, you go inside and it's a lot warmer at 50 degrees.
Caves are remarkable for that. I think this is kind of apart from the dispersal question, but I suspect that they had a similar role in sub-Saharan Africa as well, in moderating some of the extremely warm temperatures that people or our ancient hominid ancestors experienced in those places. So you could central place forage from these things and bash up a bunch of bones in the middle of the day when it's whatever 110 degrees out, and do that for a longer period of time without suffering from heat-related thermal stress. So yeah, I guess just to wrap that up, I mean, the two big things I think were clothing and housing, and then both of those things probably had pretty dramatic ripple effects. Obviously, houses are not just thermal cocoons; they serve a lot of other kind of symbolic and social.
Yeah.
Social.
Yeah, that was an interesting thing you got into, was how the emergence of houses might be connected to the emergence of like family units as like a I guess just sort of a system of maintaining social organization, something like that.
Yeah, that's you have this old idea that's really much not popular these days, but that I still kind of adhere to. It's called the Upper Paleolithic Cultural Revolution. Richard Klein, I think, penned it. And since then, we've recognized, modern human cognition certainly evolved in Africa and was present for a long time before hominins expanded into Eurasia.
Yeah.
But I still think it's undeniable that there's this fluorescence of what we recognize as quote unquote culture that occurs alongside this modern human expansion in Eurasia. Things we get cave art and carved figurines. And so there's a couple explanations for that. The traditional one was that there was some cognitive leap at that time that allowed humans to do that. I don't think that's true.
Right, so then that leaves a cultural.
So then it leaves a cultural thing, and Klein recognized this pretty early. But I see the formation of nuclear family units as sort of a social leap that could contribute to that thing, primarily because it allows, it basically allows your culture to scale up, because your basic unit of your society is no longer an individual, it's a family unit. And so from that, complexity kind of scales up and allows just an overall fluorescence of complexity throughout your entire culture.
That's something that your dissertation made me think about a lot, is how the emergence of those family structures could help explain, and I'm just spitballing, but it could help explain the placement of permanent art in places like the dark zones of caves, for instance, behind a 100-foot crawl and a climb down a narrow passage. Costly locations to access where art will last for thousands of years. If there's a growing need for rites of passage and membership in social, family, and religious groups, and for ritual that physically ties people to territories, I would think that the emergence of shamanistic, artistic, and religious practices is connected, that it could show a need for new religious structures that are kind of for the sake of social membership, like this need to mediate these new, more complicated social systems.
Yeah, I mean, you'd imagine as soon as you get nuclear family units, then you have nuclear family units that are related to each other.
Yeah.
Then you have, some semblance of what you might call a clan or a tribe or something like that can kind of emerge from that. So yeah, that's kind of what I mean by scaling up, right? Like once you have this basic social unit that basically takes your terminal unit of complexity from one individual to 4 to 6 that are operating as a cohesive economic entity, that can create this whole other realm of what we recognize as culture. And I think that's what we're seeing with this cultural revolution, with things like rock art in the dark zone of caves, but also seemingly pretty predictable, like raw material conveyance systems emerge at this time. Carved figurines emerge at this time. There's just
for people who don't know what that means. What do you mean by the raw material conveyance?
You just seem to get longer distance transport of things like ivory and chipstone raw material that seem to be fairly predictable and regionalized.
So I guess, would that maybe suggest people are becoming more rooted to specific areas, and they're building long-term connections with
territoriality, more or less. Yeah. But I know it's a stretch, and it's like kind of like connecting the disparate things with like the string on the wall or whatever. But I really do think that before you have any sort of that complexity in human cultures, you have to have a stable kind of family economic unit at the base of it.
Okay, this is kind of a related topic. It's one that I've been obsessed with for a while. I'm kind of curious what you think about it. It's there's this common narrative in archaeology about the quote birth of inequality. That there's a sort of fall from Eden that takes place at some point in prehistory where we go from egalitarian, enlightened hunter-gatherers to cruel, hierarchical agriculturalists and pastoralists. And I think it relies on the idea that the only kind of capital you can hoard is material. That unless I have a richer grave than you, or a bigger house, or more things, there can't be any inequality. But then I think of a religious figure, for instance, who might be both celibate and also eschew material possessions, but who still wields a lot of charismatic authority in society. And I have a hard time believing that Paleolithic societies were as equal as we think. So I guess my question is, do you think inequality starts in the Neolithic? Do you think there's a way to look at it in the Paleolithic?
No, it's a good question. Let me try to wrap my head around it. So
yeah.
I think I personally think, inequality in a sense has always existed between people because people are genetically diverse, and some people are born with innate characteristics that make them more useful in the context of a hunter-gatherer society than others.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that there's ever been a time when, let's just call it like interpersonal inequality has never existed. And in the absence of any kind of like social system to rectify these things, there will always be more talented hunters, for instance. There will always be more talented orators. These things all require skills, and some people are born with innate abilities that allow them to have a leverage over other people around them. And I don't think that's ever going to change it, and it's never not been the case. I think the inequality that most people are referring to when they think about it is basically some people in a society, to quote Marx, I guess, control the means of production over others, and that kind of amplifies inequalities on the basis of
so really
exchange goods.
Economic.
Economic inequality. I think in the traditional sense, when I hear people say that inequality didn't emerge until basically you get commodity-based economies, I guess that's true in a way, but there is no hope in my mind of erasing all inequality. It's always going to exist, and the best we can do is just cope with it and make people's lives that ended up on the short end of that stick tolerable or at least easy. I don't know. Related to the emergence of social complexity thing, I don't really see that. The formation of these more complex social systems during the Upper Paleolithic. I don't really know if that would have amplified inequality that much. I don't have a good sense of that. Maybe it did. Maybe it didn't. My sense from just reading hunter-gatherer literature is they still, the least of them were always at least taken care of in an economic sense. They might not have had as many, for instance, like mating opportunities. That's pretty well documented, and opportunities to carry on their genetic heritage, but I don't think that they were necessarily shunned or were suffering as much as, say, the least of us in modern society do.
Okay, so to get us back on track after those segues, we've talked about the first two stages of migration out of Africa. First, following the thermal clines along the rim of the Indian Ocean, and then moving north into the bitter cold of Eurasia. So what's the third step?
Number 3 is colonization of the New World. During that second stage, it took a while. Modern humans enter Eurasia probably 45,000 years ago. They kind of slowly expand towards the north and east across Eurasia until probably around 20,000 years ago when they reached this exposed landmass called Beringia. It connects Eurasia to North America.
Yeah, right in between modern day Alaska and Siberia in the Bering Sea.
So once they get there, they hit. This is my interpretation of what happens. This is we're getting too close to home now, right? But once they hit Alaska, they hang out there for a little while, and then sometime around 14,000 years ago, they enter North America south of the ice sheets. The difference in this stage of global human dispersal, in my mind, from a thermoregulatory perspective, is that things got easier for the first time in tens of thousands of years.
That was something I hadn't really thought about until I read your dissertation, was when thinking about colonization of the New World, and I would picture models of people expanding over the landscape slowly. I didn't include the fact that people have a reason to go south. It gets easier. It gets better the further south you go, right?
Yeah, it does.
Until you hit the equator, at least, right?
Yeah, I kind of think about this. So this is a good example of the marriage of kind of classical HBU models in this. Is this ideal free distribution model where when an animal enters a new landscape for the first time, it should theoretically always seek out the best patch in that landscape first.
Yeah.
And traditional HBU models, that's defined in terms of like the caloric yield you can get from that patch. From a thermoregulatory model, that means essentially the warmest place. So I envision this process not as this kind of wave coming from the ice-free corridor or wherever south, but people moving as quickly as they could down to, say, Texas or Mexico, places like that are super warm, and all of a sudden these hunter-gatherers that were bundled up in parkas and living in really sophisticated, robust housing for tens of thousands of years, they could suddenly live naked and homeless again. they didn't have the costs of producing these really sophisticated technologies to cope with weather anymore. They could just live, be hunter-gatherers. And I kind of see the expansion of modern humans in the New World occurring from these more temperate or like closer to the equator kind of regions, and then moving outward from there. The last places to be colonized being, say, like the Altiplano, the Andes.
Right, since then you're going back into the cold.
The Laramie Valley, and probably Wyoming in general. About the last place anybody wants to live if you're a hunter-gatherer. So that's how I see that process happening. So whereas it really was kind of a wave in Eurasia, people kind of moving north and north, developing more sophisticated technologies as they went. As soon as you hit the New World, you just move to the best place possible and then grow your population from there.
Yeah. So then that would be, I guess, whether or not people are traveling down the coast in boats, that would be an alternative explanation for why people are sticking to the coasts. Is, on the one hand, there's a sort of story of people following like a kelp highway and like these productive maritime resources, but this would explain the same kind of pattern, based more on temperature regulation and the ease of living there, right?
It explains that distribution. First, I don't really think there is significantly denser early paleoindian sites on the coast side, but temperature could explain that independently of kind of like a coastal adaptation. It's just coasts are, they're at sea level, so they're warmer. Yeah,
and there's that oceanic regulation.
Yeah.
So this would just be another reason to expect that they would kind of cluster along coastlines because of the milder annual temperatures.
Yeah, and to be clear, like I don't think that temperature rules all in these kind of models, right? Like the most ideal place to live is some combination of temperature. I think we have to acknowledge that, but it's also the resource base that you have around you. So you could live in, for like tropical regions, for instance, relatively pauperate of like large game.
Yeah.
And so you wouldn't necessarily want to settle down in a tropical region where, it's nice to be naked and homeless there. It's beautiful, but you got to subsist off of like monkeys or something instead of like mammoths and bison, things like that.
Yeah.
So there's a sweet spot there. I suspect it was the Tennessee River Valley. The density of artifacts, of early Paleoindian artifacts in the Tennessee River Valley is remarkable. It's just orders of magnitude higher than anywhere else in the country.
One of the things you wrote about in your dissertation is some field work that you did in Mongolia. And it's not really, I think, what people would expect of an archaeologist, because you were doing ethnographic field work with reindeer herders in northern Mongolia, right?
Yeah, correct. The Doha. It's all Todd Suravel's project.
What was the point of that? Why are you working with living people in Mongolia when you're thinking about Ice Age people in North America and their expansion out of Africa and all that.
Todd's the person to ask about this. Todd Serval, started this project, but I can kind of summarize his thinking probably on the subject. Is ethnoarchaeology has typically been done by studying the remains of modern peoples, making archaeological analogs from those remains.
Mm-hmm.
But is Todd's thinking that modern people just don't deposit very much trash. We're using metal objects, things that can be recycled really easily. We're not dropping chipstone everywhere.
Right.
So rather than study material remains, we should study just how people do things in mobile campsites according to some really basic environmental parameters. So like light and temperature are the two big ones. And also proximity to these kind of hot spots like entrances of doorways and wood piles, like work areas, things like that. So for my purposes, with thermoregulation, I was really interested in just, one, what kind of toolkits do people maintain now, mobile people maintain now to cope with temperature?
Yeah.
What do they have? What do they keep on them to sew? What do they keep on them to process hide? Those two big things. So I did some of that. I observed people processing hides and sewing and collected all sorts of nerdy quantitative data on that stuff. But the other thing was just observing how people change their behavior according to temperature, and that was done through observations of people inside houses, and then also time-lapse photography of people outside houses.
What was it like working in Mongolia? Day to day, like?
I loved it. I thought I was about to buy a yak and just stay over there. It's just, some of the last kind of like truly free people in the world is the way I felt. It's people that are self-sufficient, more or less self-sufficient on their animals, can more or less move anywhere they wanted. They're all extremely happy, seemingly extremely happy, even though they're, economically fairly poor. Yeah, I loved it. It was great. The day-to-day of it, it was a lot of reading.
Yeah.
Basically, the daily task was get up, try to start a fire in your house from your sleeping bag because it was super cold. Get out, change the batteries in the cameras, make some breakfast, lay around for a while.
What do the Mongolians think of you guys being there? Like,
they're friends, they're just kind of like living with your friends in a campsite. Yeah. We helped out with chores around camp, with deer maintenance and splitting wood, and just kind of living in the campsite. We did things. The two big things you do is you have these time-lapse cameras. You got to replace that every day, and then you randomly go into houses throughout the camp for 20 minutes at a time, and every minute record where people are in the house and what they're doing. Just kind of a document of activities in the house. And I kind of came in late to the project, so they were completely used to that by the time we got there. I'd imagine it was a little weird once Todd started trying to go in and do that, but I think they got used to it. And, and then every night we would upload the photos from the time lapse camera and like show families like the photos of their camp, and it was just kind of a fun sitting around laughing at people. Doing crazy stuff outside. People would pose for the cameras sometimes, and like, yeah. Yeah, and then we would do hikes around, just around the camp, and it was just really fun. It's beautiful, beautiful country.
I've seen photos of the project, and I've surveyed and excavated in Mongolia, and it really does seem like a cold, rough place to be a hunter-gatherer, and it makes me think about how necessary good social systems like family units, to go back to what we talked about earlier, how necessary those would be. For hunter-gatherers, generally there's this phrase of fusion-fission for dealing with social issues, right? Where like if you have fights or serious disagreements in a hunter-gatherer camp, a chunk of that group can just get up and walk away to a new campsite. And so you can diffuse tensions partially through movement.
Yeah.
But if you're in the middle of the Altai Mountains in the winter, it's kind of hard to just pick up and walk away at a moment's notice, right?
Oh, for sure. You're
kind of forced to be able to mediate a little better.
Exactly. That's completely That's completely true. I think. I mean, I think it's part of the reason why Mongolian conversation is just a series of jokes. It's basically like, you're forced inside with your immediate family and maybe some extended cousins or something for months at a time.
So you just need a way to keep the tension down.
You have to have a way to alleviate those
Yeah.
those like small tensions that develop between people, and yeah, it's through jokes and storytelling and things like that, things that create an air of levity within what's kind of a stressful situation. I mean, I couldn't imagine being inside a house that big with my family for that long,
Potentially like an extended family, right? Like
yeah,
not just like a
people that
mom
you
and
might
pop
not even,
and two kids, but like
people you might not
grandma,
even like
grandpa,
that much.
and cousins, and
yeah.
No,
I mean, it really drove home that notion to me that developing these tight knit sort of nuclear family units is really crucial to surviving in these environments, and houses really kind of force it upon you and force you to come up with novel ways to negotiate those relationships.
Stuck in that small space.
The thing that got me thinking about this, I honestly was like living in Laramie and knowing a lot of people that live, say, in like the mountains of Colorado, and you got to have hobbies.
Yeah,
you got to have indoor hobbies to keep your mind active, or you go crazy. I mean, cabin fever is a real thing. It's like getting depression and going a little crazy because you can't stimulate your senses as well as you can when you're faced with the outside world. So,
do you think that's something that would, I guess, contribute to new sort of physical technologies, like new types of tools or materials that people would make if suddenly you've got a portion of the year where you have to sit inside for X amount of time, and that time, you don't want that time to go to waste. You would expect new types of tool working or manufacture and things like that, and people who might have more expertise in a given craft. You would expect that to happen, right?
Yeah, I think it happens for a couple of reasons. So, for instance, the perfect example of that from the old world is these like intricate little figurines that you start seeing in Upper Paleolithic houses. They're like birds, and little like horses and stuff like that. It's the same thing people do now with carving those things, but it's also basically you're placed in direct proximity with all these people doing these things, and there's a greater chance of transmitting those ideas between people when you're confined in a space like that. And so I think you do get a greater probability of like material culture fluorescence in a situation like that, where ideas are constantly being exchanged in a place like that. I wrote a paper a while back that nobody ever cites, but I'll try to promote it here. I think like Folsom fluting, which is like, as far as I can tell, does not have much of a functional reason, is probably an outgrowth of that. So basically, the idea was that you find more fluted points in colder places on the plains. Yeah, and it's the sort of thing I think that you would do sitting around inside a house in the winter. Is mess around with flint knapping and develop like novel techniques for doing that. And then
maybe more attention to the aesthetics than you would otherwise be concerned with.
Yeah, exactly. And when you look at the Folsom record, fluting looks like it does occur a lot inside houses.
For people who don't know, also that's fluting. It's when you take a stone spear point and you drive a flake off, basically from the base of the point out towards the tip, so you can slot it onto a spear or a shaft of a dart, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, it's an extremely risky form of flint knapping is probably the best thing to know about it. Like, about 1 in 3 times somebody tries this, it fails. And so really, and it doesn't seem to provide any kind of functional advantage in terms of the hafting capabilities or anything. It's just, but it's really, really cool looking. And they're, widely considered to be kind of the pinnacle of Stone Age technology globally. Is the Folsom point. Yeah. And Folsom it's often characterized as a plains tradition, but it's really a Rocky Mountain tradition. Folsom sites are a Rocky Mountain kind of cultural adaptation in places.
Yeah, the oldest site now being Barker Gulch, which is in Middle Park in Colorado.
Barker Gulch, great evidence for people fluting inside houses there. Yeah, and this is a site that's at what, like, it's 8 to 9,000 feet.
Yeah. Oh shoot! I should know that.
It's
low 8,000s, I think.
And it's occupied during the Younger Dryas, like the coldest the coldest temperature interval in the human occupation of the New World. Middle Park was likely a very, very cold place when people were living there, and they probably weren't spending a ton of time outside those houses. They were just holed up.
Going back to how harsh of a place Mongolia can be in the winter, and how friendly and hospitable Mongolians are, maybe as partially a consequence of that, I have a story to share. While I was on a field school in Mongolia during my undergrad, there was a guy from Quebec who, during one of our lunch breaks, walked up to a random gur that he saw in the distance, and he just walked over to it and he knocked on the door, and some old lady opened the door, and he like talked with her for a minute, and I couldn't hear what they were saying, and then he walked inside, and then he came out a minute later with an old guy and got on the back of his motorcycle with him and just drove off.
Yeah, it's kind
probably had a really fun day.
It's kind of a shocking thing for people that are accustomed to like a world in which you don't just knock on somebody's door.
Yeah.
Like you could just, you show up to somebody's house, knock on the door, and they usually invite you in for tea or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's great. I mean, the amount of trust that culture must have of each other is just so, it was so foreign and so refreshing at the same time.
Now that the dissertation and the saga in Mongolia are completed, what keeps you busy?
Yeah, that was my fun PhD. Now I have a job. but luckily my job's really great. I'm the state archaeologist for Wyoming, and so every state archaeologist kind of does things differently. They all have different mandates, different states. This job is very much focused on research, education.
It's pretty rare for a state archaeologist, right? That's a pretty nice.
I'd say it's definitely in the minority. Yeah. 'Cause a lot of state archaeologists are not attached to academic institutions like this one is.
Yeah.
So it's research, outreach, education. So I teach at the university every few semesters. And then recently added onto that was recovery of human remains from private and state lands in Wyoming. So archaeological human remains.
Yeah, yeah.
So the day-to-day of this is, it's really diverse. I love it for that reason. But I usually do some writing on research stuff in the morning. We're currently still conducting excavations at the Laprelle Mammoth site, Clovis site. I'm working on that. And then we're involved with several other excavations throughout the state, more late prehistoric stuff. So we did excavations at Medicine Lodge Creek, a really well-known late prehistoric site in northern Wyoming last summer, dealing with that stuff. We're trying to put together a book on ceramics, kind of a complete U-turn for me, but it's more or less like a culture history of the last 1,500 years in Wyoming based on ceramic types and where they're found and how old they are and that kind of thing. And then, working on several other excavations throughout the state.
Yeah, the one that I am kind of most aware of is Powers.
Yeah, so I worked since graduating with my dissertation. Been wrapping up field work at two paleoindian sites. One of them is Powers 2, the other one's called the Sisters Hill site. So I finished up excavations at Powers 2 in 2021. No, 2020. Sorry, lost a year there. And actually,
We've all done that.
I just submitted some research for that. That Powers 2 site is it's a hematite quarry. It's the only hematite quarry identified from North America, north of Mexico.
So red ochre.
Red ochre. Yeah, it's paint. It's a paint mine.
Yeah.
The cool thing about this paint mine is it's the oldest one in the Americas that's been discovered so far, which is
10,000 plus, right?
Yeah, it calibrated. It's basically the tail end of Clovis through about 11,005, something like that. So basically, just younger Dryas aged.
Yeah.
The cool thing about it too is that people actually sat on this quarry and did a lot of flint knapping, did a lot of weaponry repair. So it's just full of really awesome artifacts.
Yeah, I kind of remember hearing at some point that it had some stupid number of Clovis points that had come out of it, right?
Yeah, we're up to 80 or 90, something like that. Like from our excavations alone, which were just 6 square meters, we found 30 projectile points.
Jeez.
So it's like 5 per square meter. Yeah, it's crazy dense. And it's not just points though. There's like also, there's a ton of flakes. People were flint knapping there. There's really interesting bone tools that were used as quarry implements, it turns out. So We found pieces of antler that had been blunted at the end from like prying up rocks, big segments of ribs with blunted ends that were used to quarry big bison long bones that had been like
cool.
spirally fractured, and then those like sharp edges of the bone were used to chip into the hematite. And then we found a piece of a bone rod, which is like a pretty classic kind of Clovis artifact that was used in presumably in hafting. And then this really weird there's a kind of two episodes of occupation there. This earlier one that's associated with the Younger Dryas, and then this later kind of stem point occupation. So the stem point occupation had to dig through the quarry tailings of that earlier occupation to get to the hematite.
Yeah.
And they actually, in the process, when they like backfilled those quarry pits and left these little piles of artifacts, and they were all points and bifaces, and one of those artifacts was this incised bison rib that kind of looks like a ruler.
Huh.
It's like 50 incisions with every fourth or fifth one has a little bit longer than the other. Super odd artifact,
Yeah.
completely unique in the paleoindian record. And it was just crazy when that thing came out of the ground. I couldn't believe it. It was pretty wild.
Jeez.
So that's Powers too. It's a truly unique site.
And you can trace the ochre from Powers to other places around Wyoming, right?
Yeah, the only two places that have been directly sourced are the La Prelle Clovis site. It's about 80 kilometers away,
Yeah.
and then the Hell Gap site, which is just right over the hill. But ochre's been found in a ton of sites of this age in Wyoming. The Carter Kerr McGee site, the Sheeman site, Agate Basin site, and the Anzac burial, the Anzac Clovis child, was covered in red ochre. And we haven't sourced any of the ochre from those sites yet, but I'm really excited at some point in the future to try to do that, because I do think that this particular hematite source likely had a pretty widespread distribution during this period, because we have raw materials at this site from North Dakota, and then it looks like we have some stuff from Texas, Alabates and Edwards Chert. So that's 1,200 kilometers away. Crazy conveyance distance.
Yeah.
I think it's likely that ochre was moving a long ways, and it was really there's ochre sources in a lot of places, but this sort of ochre, this hematite, is not all that common. It's associated specifically with massive iron deposits, and there's just not many of those in the continent. So there's only so many places where that stuff could come from. Beyond that, so Sisters Hill site is another one we worked on. It was known as a Hell Gap site, so about 11,500 years old or so. And then we went back a few years ago and found another slightly younger component above it that was missed back in the 70s. So we spent several years digging at that site. And really the value of that one is it's just a great stratigraphic record. It has this there's just a lot of fidelity to this alluvial sequence, and it positions these cultures really well with relation to the environment that they were going through, kind of the very end of the Pleistocene, very earliest Holocene, and when the environment was changing really rapidly, and we have these two really nice cultural occupations kind of right in with that, situated really well, that environmental record.
Here's kind of a tangential question to start wrapping things up. Going forward, if you could work anywhere, answering any questions, and you didn't have any obstacles like permits, etc., what are the big questions to you that kind of keep you up at night in archaeology?
Globally?
Yeah, anywhere.
I mean, if I could do anything in global archaeology, I would be looking for Upper Paleolithic sites at the extreme far northern margin of Siberia, I think.
Kind of that Yana rhino horn site kind of zone.
I think up there, and then south into like the Transbaikal region too.
Yeah.
I really think that region is super special, and there's a lot of great people doing research over there on like Denisova Cave and that stuff. But I just really feel like that's the most exciting place in the world to do hunter-gatherer archaeology. Or ultimately it's the hearth of the people that ended up in the New World.
Right.
It's the ancestors. You're looking at the ancestors of the people that eventually entered the New World, and that's cool to me. Like where everything I've done in my career all started in Eurasia.
Yeah.
I think that's exciting. I think beyond that, I love geology and like geoarchaeology, and I would I would get a huge kick out of studying early hominin sites in Africa and trying to understand the geology and where you might find those hominin bones. Like we talked briefly about the idea that hominins were drawn to these cave systems as kind of thermoregulatory refugia. I really would love to test some of those hypotheses using kind of modern temperature data and modern animal behavior and things like that.
Yeah, that's something I've been dwelling on a lot since I read that prediction in your dissertation.
Yeah, you find hominin bones in these caves all the time. Like that's that Cradle of Humanity region where they're finding all those like Australopithecines, and then the Rising Star Cave. What they call that one? I'm blanking right now.
Homo naledi.
Naledi.
Yeah.
Where they found naledi. The idea has been that like you're getting a biased view of this because it's really the only place where bones preserve. So the thought was like, were people really living in here?
Right.
Or
Do they really care about these caves all that much, or is that just the one place they survive?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I really want to answer. I want that question answered. Like in my view, they were preferentially using these cave systems, and that's why their bones are ending up there in like really large quantities. But yeah. So yeah, our hominins basically are they the cave bears of South Africa, right? Or are they just like, the only reason we find them there is it's the only place they preserve?
Yeah.
I think that's a big question that needs answered, because if hominins are using caves basically as like a central place foraging like node, that says a lot about early hominin behavior. And I don't think that question has been adequately addressed. Although I should caveat all this by saying this is really not my world. Like I'm a total interloper into all this old world stuff. I love it, but like I said, I do too much field work in Wyoming to really devote myself completely to reading every Journal of Human Evolution paper that gets published.
That is one of the things though that that kind of drew me to paleoindian archaeology in particular for work in North America is that by comparison with, like, say if you're an expert in the ancestral Puebloans in the Southwest, like now you're going to be working in New Mexico and Arizona and Utah and Colorado for your entire career, but with paleoindian archaeology it seems like it does give you a little more of a right to step into another lane and think about these analogous and similar patterns of human life in other places.
Yeah, I think it's because paleoindian archaeology shares a lot of characteristics with old world Paleolithic archaeology.
Yeah.
Big game hunters.
Yeah.
Living at a time when the Ice Age, when Ice Ages still existed. And also paleoindian archaeology is really focused on these sites are buried really deeply. There's a lot of time between when they were deposited and now. So you have to have a really firm grasp on geology and geomorphology and that kind of thing that you really don't when you're basically a culture historian. That's kind of why I think there's a lot of congruence between and interest between paleoindian archaeology and people that are doing stuff in the old world.
Yeah.
To finish up, if you had to recommend to people 3 sites to learn more about paleoindian archaeology in Wyoming, what should they read?
Oh, that's good question. I think the first book you should buy is the Agate Basin monograph.
Uh-huh.
The Agate Basin site. It's a phenomenal archaeological site, but the book that was produced on it by George Friesen is, I think, widely regarded probably one of the finest monographs of any site ever produced. It's just beautifully illustrated. The writing's great. The analyses of everything were really groundbreaking at the time.
Yeah.
I think that's the first thing, the Agate Basin book. You definitely need to learn about the Hell Gap site. The Hell Gap site has one of the more comprehensive records of paleoindian archaeology that exists.
Work has been going on there for decades, right?
Yeah, the Harvard dug it in the 60s, and now Marcel Kornfeld's and Mary Lou Larson have been excavating there since mid-90s, a couple decades. So the Hell Gap site's special because it's the confluence of a lot of raw material and a really good depositional setting and a good place to live. And so people spanning 13,000 to 8,000 years ago camped in the same place over and over again, the same spot, the exact same spot. And so it's one of the only places in North America where you have that Paleoindian period in stratified context. So that's a really important site to know about. And number 3, the Laprelle site. I mean, the Laprelle Clovis site is shaping up to be one of the most important archaeological sites in North America. I don't think that's overstating anything, especially for the Paleoindian period. Just the clarity we have on that event that happened almost 13,000 years ago is pretty unparalleled, where we can actually see activity areas and piles of flakes that represent flint napping episodes and houses and a mammoth and all this fauna that accompanies it, bone needles and beads, like an ochre stain. It's just remarkable. And, we've been working there since 2014, and it just keeps getting better every year. There just keeps being surprising insights. And the little bit of literature that's been produced on that site so far is definitely worth looking at.
Laprelle is a great note to end on. I would second that. Thanks for taking the time, Spencer. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for coming up with great questions.
And thank you for listening to this episode of The Tell. Until next time. Hey everybody. If you enjoyed the podcast and you want to help me talk to more people in more places, please consider donating. You can do so on my Patreon as a recurring donor, as well as on my website if you'd rather do a one-time donation. The links are patreon.com/Sebastian Weatherby and www.sebastianweatherby.com. Show notes are also available on my website, where you can find citations and comments and other relevant information about the things we talked about today. Thanks again for listening.